The land stretched endlessly beneath a pale winter sun, all gold and silver and silence. Wind moved through the prairie grass like breath over a sleeping world, and somewhere between the hills rode a man who believed he had buried his heart long ago. His name was whispered in town, sometimes with respect, sometimes with pity, but always with a note of distance, the way people speak of those who have chosen solitude as their only companion. He was 34, strong in the shoulders, broad in the chest, his jaw lined with the sort of quiet that comes from surviving more than living. The ranch he owned was wide as the horizon itself, filled with good horses and loyal hands, yet the rooms of his home stood hollow. He'd once loved a woman who said he was made for greatness, not gentleness. When she left for another man, one who wrote her poems instead of building her fences, he stopped believing in the language of affection. Since then, his world had become clean, predictable, and heartless. Mornings began with the creak of saddle leather. Nights ended with the whisper of whiskey against his teeth. The men who worked for him admired his fairness, but feared his silence. They joked that their boss was a statue carved from oak, steady, unmovable, untouched by anything as foolish as love. The town nearby lived on gossip. Women at the mercantile murmured that a man like him ought to have a wife by now, while others insisted he'd sworn off the idea after being betrayed. He rode into town rarely, only to trade or send a letter, never to linger. The saloon keeper would lift a hand in greeting, and the cowboy would nod, drink one glass, and leave before the piano started. Sheriff Clay, an old friend from younger days, often tried to drag him into conversation. "You keep living like this," Clay would warn, "and one day you'll forget how to speak." The cowboy only smiled, a small sad curl of the lips that said he already had. Then came the winter morning that changed everything. The wind carried a strange sound that day, something between a song and a prayer. It came from the far ridge, where snow still clung stubbornly to the rocks. The men were rounding the horses when they saw her first, a lone figure walking the dirt road toward the ranch. She moved slowly, her steps careful, as though she'd been walking for miles without rest. Wrapped in a worn shawl the color of rusted clay, her dark hair loose against the cold, she looked too fragile for this land. And yet there was strength in her bearing, a stillness that drew every gaze. When she reached the gate, the foreman approached her, uncertain. She spoke softly, her accent shaping the air like wind over water. Most of the men couldn't understand her words, but they caught enough to know she was asking for shelter, just for the night, until the storm passed. Someone muttered that she was Apache, and silence followed like a shadow. In those parts, mistrust ran deep between settlers and the tribes. The cowboy stepped forward then, his voice calm but guarded. He asked her where she came from, what brought her here. She lifted her eyes to his, steady, unreadable, and said only that she had walked far and had no place left to go. For a long moment, he said nothing. Behind him, the wind picked up, stirring the dust between them. Then, without another word, he nodded toward the house. "There's warmth inside," he said. The men exchanged uneasy glances, but none dared question him. She followed quietly as he led her to the cabin near the corral, where fire already smoldered. He gestured for her to sit, fetched water, and poured her a cup with hands that felt suddenly too large, too clumsy for such gentleness. She accepted it without fear, her eyes flicking toward the flames, watching them the way one watches a memory. He told himself he was only being decent, that any human wandering the plains in winter deserved warmth. But as he studied her face, he saw something he hadn't seen in years, calmness. Not submission, not sorrow, just peace. It unsettled him. Most people avoided his gaze. She met it. Most spoke too quickly. She said almost nothing. By nightfall, snow began to fall again, thin flakes drifting against the window glass. He built up the fire and laid a blanket nearby. She thanked him with a small nod, the sort that carried the weight of entire sentences. He turned away before she could see the confusion in his eyes. Martha, the ranch cook, came by with stew and raised an eyebrow at the sight of the woman. "She's harmless," the cowboy said quietly. Martha smiled faintly. "That's not what you're afraid of," she replied, leaving the food by the hearth. When he returned later to check the fire, She was asleep. The flickering light painted her face in gold and shadow, and for a moment he simply watched. Outside, the snow thickened, soft as feathers. The cabin felt different, less like a room, more like a heartbeat. He didn't understand it. He'd built his life on distance, yet one stranger's presence had filled the emptiness with warmth he hadn't known he missed. He stepped outside, breathing the cold until it bit through his thoughts. The stars stretched wide above, 1,000 silent witnesses. He remembered his father's words from long ago, that a man who closes his heart to pain also closes it to grace. He dismissed it as nonsense then. Now, under that endless night sky, it didn't sound so foolish. When dawn came, she was gone from the cabin. Panic flashed through him before he saw her by the stables, gently feeding one of the horses from her hand. The animal, usually skittish, stood perfectly still beneath her touch. The sight caught something deep inside him. He found himself walking toward her, not to speak, not to question, just to be near enough to understand. She looked up when he stopped beside her. The light hit her eyes, and for an instant he saw in them the reflection of every mile she'd walked, every loss she'd carried. She didn't ask to stay, didn't beg for kindness. She simply waited, as though she trusted that he would know what was right. He opened his mouth to tell her she could rest another night, maybe two. But before the words came, Sheriff Clay rode up fast, his horse lathered and breathing hard. "You'd best be careful," he called out. "Town's talking. Some don't take kindly to strangers, especially her kind." The cowboy's jaw tightened. He looked at the woman again, her calm unbroken by the warning. She didn't flinch, didn't turn away. Something inside him shifted, a quiet defiance, slow but certain. He realized then that he'd spent years building walls high enough to keep out sorrow, only to find that they'd kept out everything else too. He turned back to Clay, voice low but steady. "Let them talk," he said. Clay frowned, studying him. "You sure about this?" The cowboy looked toward the woman standing against the rising sun, her shawl glowing like flame. "No," he said softly, "but maybe it's time I was wrong about something." And as the wind carried the snow across the open land, he understood that the silence inside him had finally begun to crack. Morning crept across the plains in a hush, spilling pale gold through the windows of the ranch house. The fire had burned down to soft embers, and the scent of wood smoke mingled with the faint sweetness of coffee. He stood by the door, watching her through the drifting light. She was outside already, sleeves rolled to the elbow, carrying buckets of water as though she had always belonged there. The horses, wary of strangers, followed her with curious eyes. She moved among them without fear, whispering words in her own tongue that seemed to calm the restless air itself. He didn't speak. He only watched, the way one might watch the first sign of spring after a long, unkind winter. Every movement she made seemed deliberate, measured, graceful, born from some rhythm deeper than speech. When she finally turned toward him, the morning sun lit her face, and he felt that strange unease again, that quiet stirring he couldn't name. Over the next days, she stayed. At first, he told himself it was temporary. He let her work in exchange for shelter, a fair trade, nothing more. But the way she carried herself changed the silence of the ranch. She hummed softly while sweeping the porch, her voice low and steady, blending with the wind. She mended old reins, gathered herbs along the creek, spoke little, and yet her presence filled every hollow corner of his world. Even the ranch hands began to relax around her, their suspicion slowly dissolving into curiosity. At supper one evening, Martha placed a bowl before the woman and said, "You work like you've got something to prove." The woman looked up, her dark eyes calm. "To no one," she replied softly. "Only to the wind that keeps me moving." Her words hung in the air, simple yet heavy with meaning. The cowboy said nothing, but later, when he stepped outside, he found himself repeating them under his breath. That night, the rain came, a slow, cold drizzle that turned the yard to mud. She stood by the window, watching it fall. He brought him more firewood, glancing at her reflection in the glass. "Storm will last till morning," he said quietly. She nodded, her fingers resting against the window frame. "Rain washes the past," she murmured. "Or tries to." He wanted to ask what past she carried, but something in her stillness stopped him. Instead, he handed her a blanket, and for the first time, she smiled. It wasn't bright or sudden, just a small curve of gratitude that reached her eyes and lingered there like light over water. In the weeks that followed, they found an unspoken rhythm. She taught him to read signs in the wind, how to listen to the land's quiet language. He showed her the ways of the ranch, the endless chores, the simple rituals that made the wilderness a kind of home. When they rode out together, the silence between them felt less like distance and more like trust. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the air shimmered with heat, they stopped by a dry riverbed. She dismounted first, kneeling to touch the cracked earth. "Once this was full of life," she said softly. "Water, birds, laughter. Now only dust remembers." He crouched beside her, watching her fingertips trace the fissures. "Maybe it'll come back," he offered. She looked at him, her gaze steady, ancient. Everything returns when it is truly wanted. That night, her words echoed in his mind. For the first time in years, he wondered what he wanted. Not what he owed, not what he had lost, but what his soul longed for. The next morning, he noticed her by the corral, whispering to a frightened mare. The animal had been wild since birth, biting, kicking, impossible to break. Yet under her voice, the horse grew still. When she reached out, it lowered its head as if surrendering to something sacred. The cowboy felt his chest tighten. It wasn't just that she had a gift. It was that she lived as if the world itself could still be healed. But not everyone saw it that way. Word spread through town of the Indian woman staying at his ranch. At the saloon, men muttered between drinks that the cowboy had lost his pride, that he was letting savages under his roof. Sheriff Clay rode out one evening, his face lined with worry. "You're stirring talk," he warned. "Some of the boys don't like it. They'll make trouble if you keep her here." The cowboy's jaw hardened. "She's done nothing wrong." "That don't matter to them," Clay replied. "They see what they want to see. You've built a name in this county. Don't throw it away for something you can't keep." He said nothing more. When Clay left, the house felt colder. That night, the woman sensed a change in him. She asked if she should leave, her tone without resentment, only quiet understanding. "You've given me more kindness than most," she said. "But kindness can turn dangerous when the wind shifts." He shook his head, though his heart was heavy. "I don't care what they say." She studied him for a long moment, then spoke softly. "You care more than you admit. The world has taught you to." He looked away, the truth of her words like salt against an open wound. For years, he'd hidden behind strength, behind the idea that caring was weakness. Yet here she stood, unarmed, unafraid, her presence revealing every crack in the armor he'd built. The following day, a group of men rode up the hill, faces he recognized from town, eyes hard with judgment. They demanded he send her away. One spat at the ground, saying she didn't belong among decent folk. The cowboy didn't reach for his gun. He simply stood his ground, voice low but steady. "This land belongs to me," he said. "And while she's here, she's under my roof, under my word." The men left with curses on their lips, but the message was clear. The peace of the ranch was no longer safe. That evening, as the sun bled out behind the mountains, the woman walked out to the fence line, the wind tugging at her shawl. He followed, unsure of what to say. She turned to him, her face serene in the fading light. "They will come again," she said. "I know. You could end this if you let me go." He shook his head. "And lose what little right I've got left to my own choices." "No." She looked at him then, not with gratitude, but something deeper. "You are not as cold as you pretend," she whispered. He felt the truth of it ripple through him, a warmth that frightened him more than any threat. She stepped closer, the air between them trembling. For a moment, neither spoke. The sun slipped away, leaving only the silver of twilight around them. Then she said quietly, "You cannot fight the whole world." He met her gaze. "Maybe not, but I can fight for what feels right." A gust of wind lifted her hair, carrying the scent of rain. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled low across the plains. She closed her eyes, listening. "Storm's coming," she murmured. He watched her silhouette against the rising dark, the shawl swirling like flame. "Yes," he said softly, "it is." And in that fragile silence before the first drop fell, he realized the storm wasn't just in the sky. It was in his heart, breaking open after too many years of drought. The storm arrived before dawn, sweeping across the plains with the wild grief of something ancient and unresolved. Wind howled through the canyons, rattling shutters and bending the pines until their branches groaned. The ranch shivered under the weight of it. Inside, the fire burned low, and he sat awake beside it, staring into the orange coals as if they might offer an answer. She slept near the hearth, her shawl wrapped tight, her breath calm despite the thunder shaking the world outside. He envied her stillness. Every sound felt like a reminder of the words spoken in town, the men's hateful eyes, the danger that now had a name and a direction. When the storm broke into morning, it left behind a bruised sky and silence that rang too loud. He stepped outside to find hoofprints by the gate, deep and fresh. Riders had come while they slept, watching, waiting, leaving their warning in the mud. Martha stood on the porch, arms crossed over her apron, eyes grim. "They won't stop now," she said quietly. "You brought her peace, but peace don't sit easy with small men." He nodded, though his mind was far from calm. Inside, she was already awake, her gaze sharp, reading the worry in his face before he could speak. "They came," she said simply. It wasn't a question. He tried to smile, but it faltered halfway. "They left tracks, nothing more." She rose, folding the blanket neatly, her movements measured as always. "Tracks lead somewhere," she said. He should have told her to pack, to ride east, to vanish before things turned violent. Instead, he found himself saying, "You stay here. No one lays a hand on you." The words left his mouth like a vow carved in stone. She didn't argue, though her eyes softened with something like sorrow. "You fight because you think it will make you right," she murmured. "But rightness is not always what keeps a man alive." By noon, Sheriff Clay rode up, mud splattering his boots, the brim of his hat heavy with rain. "You've got until sundown," he said quietly. "They're coming back." Half the town stirred up. "You know I can't hold them off alone." The cowboy didn't answer at once. He looked past Clay toward the horizon, where the clouds were breaking apart, thin lines of light spilling through like forgiveness. "If they come," he said, "I'll talk to them. I'm done running from things I believe in." Clay shook his head. "You're a fool," he muttered, "but a fool I'll ride beside if it comes to that." The afternoon passed in heavy silence. She helped Martha gather supplies, though her movements seemed slower, her thoughts elsewhere. When she stepped outside later, he followed. They stood near the corral, where the air still smelled of rain and horses shifted nervously. "You shouldn't stay for me," she said at last. "Your land, your name. They'll take them if you stand beside me." He met her gaze, calm and unyielding. What's the worth of land or name if a man loses what's decent in him? She drew a breath that trembled faintly. "In my tribe, when two souls choose to walk together, they tie a red cord around their wrists. It means that come storm or sun, their fates are bound." She paused, her voice thinning like smoke. "I lost that cord once. Maybe I was never meant to find another." He reached into his coat and pulled out a strip of leather, worn but strong. "Then take this," he said. "It's all I've got." He held it out, and she looked at it for a long time before tying it around her wrist. When she finished, she lifted his hand and tied the other end around his. For a heartbeat, neither breathed. The wind eased, the world narrowing to the quiet touch between them. Sundown came like a blade of fire through the clouds. Dust rose in the distance, riders. He stepped forward, squinting, counting the shapes as they drew near. Clay rode up beside him, rifle slung low. "No way this ends clean," the sheriff muttered. "Talk fast if you plan to." The men halted just beyond the fence, their faces hard with pride and fear. The leader spat into the dirt. "We told you to send her away. You think you're better than the rest of us." The cowboy stepped closer, unarmed, his voice carrying steady across the wind. "No," he said. "I just know what I'm willing to stand for." They laughed, a short, ugly sound. One lifted his rifle. Clay raised his in return. For a moment, it felt as if the air itself held its breath. Then the woman stepped forward, out from the shadow of the barn, her shawl whipping in the wind. The sight of her silenced them more than any gun could. She raised a hand, not in fear, but peace. "I came here for shelter," she said softly. "I mean no harm to any man. But if harm must come, let it fall on me, not on him." Her calm broke something inside him. He moved to her side, his hand brushing hers. "No," he said, voice rough. "Not again. Not while I'm still breathing." The men hesitated, torn between hate and uncertainty. Then Clay spoke, loud enough for all to hear. "You call yourselves decent folk, but what I see are cowards picking at ghosts. This woman's done nothing but live." His voice cracked like thunder. "And if you lay a hand on her, you'll answer to me first." The silence stretched until it broke under the sound of hooves retreating. One by one, the riders turned away, muttering curses lost to the wind. The last man lingered, his eyes dark with shame, then spat once more and followed the rest. When the dust settled, the land felt new again, as if the storm had taken more than clouds with it. Clay exhaled, lowering his rifle. "You'll have a quiet life after this, or none at all," he said, then rode away without waiting for an answer. She turned to him slowly. "You risked everything," she whispered. "For me." He shook his head. "For what's right." But when she reached up and touched his cheek, the truth was there in the silence between them. Days passed. The town's anger faded into rumor, then into nothing. The ranch returned to its quiet rhythm, but something within them had shifted, too deep to name. They worked side by side, laughter blooming where silence once lived. At night, they shared stories, his of youth and lost chances, hers of stars and old songs that never die. Spring came early that year. The fields turned green, the horses foaled, and the sky opened wide with promise. One evening, she led him to the edge of the canyon, where the light turned everything gold. There, an elder from her tribe waited, his presence solemn and kind. She turned to the cowboy and smiled. "You said you'd stand beside me," she whispered. "Stand with me now." They knelt together, the elder's words flowing like river water. No church bells, no crowd, only the earth beneath them and the wind carrying its blessing. When it was done, she rested her forehead against his. The cord still bound their wrists, swaying softly in the breeze. As the sun sank, he whispered, "So this is what it feels like to belong." She smiled, eyes glistening. "No," she said. "This is what it feels like to be free." The light faded, painting them in the last warmth of day. Far below, the canyon wind rose and carried their laughter across the plains, until it was impossible to tell where one heart ended and the other began.